Hello once again, and welcome to Trading Places Unit 4, Part 4. In this video, we'll look at the home of the slave, the subjugation of a continent from the Sahara to South Africa.
And now for something completely different.
To fully understand the effects of human mobility, it is necessary to investigate the theme of movement in conjunction with the qualifier of scale. Through most of human history, the cost of travel and trade over land was expensive in terms of time and energy spent, as individuals could only travel by foot or by means of some domesticated animal, or a team of animals. This contributed to a great deal of distance decay. With the introduction of improved sea travel through ships such as Chinese junks and Portuguese caravels, the friction of distance was reduced dramatically. As the Europeans moved across the globe, they changed the cultural landscape as well as the regional demography, which refers to the composition of a particular human population. When movement results in permanent relocation across significant distances, it is classified as migration. The Europeans engaged in significant international migration, which is movement across country borders. When a person leaves the home country, he or she is classified as an emigrant, whereas moving into a country makes a person an immigrant. European colonies around the world presented millions of Europeans with new opportunities. These positive prospects created significant pull factors that lure people or induce them to emigrate to a new area. People also choose to move due to push factors, which are negative situations in one's place of origin. These can revolve around economic, environmental, or violent issues. Some migrants, such as the Europeans, had the luxury of choice, leading to voluntary migration, where the role of pull and push factors were at work. Other migrations dealt with the fear and misfortune of compulsion, producing forced migrations that rendered the theoretical weighing of options irrelevant. In the 15th through 19th centuries, African realms were ravaged and transformed by the Atlantic slave trade. This famous image shows Ana de Sousa Njinga, ruler of the realm of Ndongo, which is modern-day Angola. Here she meets with Portuguese officials while using a servant as a throne to maintain her royal dignity. Africa has been referred to as the Dark Continent, historically because so little was known about the majority of its people. That is, until Europeans arrived with conquest on their minds. Today, Africa is divided among 54 states, with more than 3,000 ethnicities, and over 2,000 languages spoken in various regions. And please bear in mind, Africa is indeed a continent and not a country. So, with that in mind, we ask this essential question. How did the Atlantic trade routes affect the slave trade in the diverse continent of Africa? In the early 15th century, before the expansion of the Europeans, Africa's many cultures reflected its geographic diversity. Now, North Africa was fully Islamic, with Egypt as its most prosperous realm. West Africa's cities were typically Muslim commercial and cultural centers, connected mostly through the trans-Saharan camel caravan trade routes to North Africa. However, most of the people lived in farming villages that followed traditional religions, often worshipping local gods. The first we'll look at is animism, which is the range of beliefs and practices in which souls or spirits exist not only in humans, but also in animals, plants, rocks, natural phenomena such as thunder, geographic features such as mountains or rivers, or other parts of the natural environment such as things like the sun, the moon, or the stars. The second type we'll look at is shamanism, which is the range of beliefs and practices regarding communication with the spiritual world. Now, the key practitioner in a community is usually a shaman. Some terms have referred to these people as witch doctors or even holy men. East Africa's coastal city-states were strongly influenced by Islam and Indian Ocean trade. In the East African interior, farmers and hunters often retained their traditional cultures, while the Ethiopians practiced an ancient form of Christianity. Central and South Africa was not yet influenced by Islam or Christianity, and was populated mostly by traditional villages and stateless societies. They had evolved this way likely to reduce the concentration of large populations, which would make the transmission of diseases like malaria much more common and much more deadly. Regardless, there were some strong states that would eventually succumb to the coming onslaught of the Europeans. Slavery is an institution in which some people own others and use them for labor. Its origins predate written records, and today, there are perhaps as few as 10 million or as many as 30 million slaves worldwide, depending on the definition.
Now, the term slave probably had its origin with the term Slav, basically referring to the Slavic people in southern Europe who were enslaved repeatedly throughout history. In Africa, as in most regions, slaves were typically prisoners of war or victims of raids. They were criminals, debtors, even included children. In some regions of Africa, the rich owners equated their wealth by how many slaves they owned, more than even livestock, let's say. In many instances, slaves could buy or earn their freedom. For example, if they adopted Islam. Now, they couldn't just wake up one morning and say, "Hey, I'm a Muslim," and then walk free. They would usually have to do this over a long period of time. Motivated by mercantilism and the desire to spread Christianity, the Portuguese were the first to establish trading posts along West Africa. They were the first mainly due to, that's right, geography. Now, between 1497 and 1498, the Portuguese sailor Vasco da Gama was the first European to discover an all-water route past the Islamic empires and into India. Later, in the 1500s, Portugal used slaves for labor on sugar plantations in Africa and Brazil. This was due to the fact that Africans were more accustomed to the climate and diseases, not to mention the lack of distance decay from West Africa to Brazil. Furthermore, many Europeans followed a racist ideology associating dark skin with a low degree of humanity. Now, by the latter 1600s, the English, Dutch, and French shipped slaves as well. From the late 1500s and into the 1800s, a massive network of trade evolved between three predominantly different regions, each specializing in its own industries that were best suited for its resources and environments. Between Europe and Africa, manufactured goods such as weapons and textiles were transported. Between Africa and the Americas, that was the Middle Passage, transporting slaves. And between the Americas and Europe, sugar, cotton, tobacco, coffee, and rum were some of the many products that were highly sought after. As I said, each region specialized in what the other regions needed. To give some perspective, in the 1500s, approximately 300,000 slaves were transported from Africa to the Americas. 200 years later, that number skyrocketed to around 6 million slaves transported in that century. All told, more than 11 million slaves were estimated to have been forcibly relocated to the Americas. And that doesn't include the more than 2 million slaves estimated to have died en route due to the inhumane conditions of being packed into the holds of ships for weeks with very little food, water, or exercise of any kind. This is what has been called the African diaspora, in which millions were spread around the globe.
And as you can see, the vast majority made their way into South America and the Caribbean. Brazil acquired around 38% of all the slaves in those centuries, with Spanish America acquiring around 16%. Approximately 40% went to the Caribbean, and by comparison, a relatively small number went into North America, numbering around 4%. And even some, around 2%, made their way into Europe and throughout Asia.